based in Capitol Hill on Six News, a show all about law and government in Australia. I'm Stuart Jeffrey, and today we're covering Trump's trial, which has just come out a few hours ago. I'm joined by a friend of the show turned international contributor to Six News, Elijah Granite. Thanks for joining us. You're in the US right now, I believe.
Yep, I'm coming to you from California, and as always, it's a pleasure to be on.
All right, well, you're former US law student turned UK law student, so I'm sure you know your way around a few of these legal issues, which is why we're having you on for this. Just to start with, for those who have been living underneath a rock, what's the basic facts of the accusation here against Donald Trump? Beyond, well, of course, we all know that it was a rape accusation, but just beyond that, are there any specifics we should know before we go into the discussion?
Yeah, so Donald Trump is facing a lot of legal accusations right now, but the one in this case that's just happened in New York is that in either 1995 or 1996, he is accused of sexually assaulting and raping a woman, E Jean Carroll, who became a writer in a department store in New York. And then this was an accusation that emerged in around about when he was running for president. And then in 2019, Donald Trump denounced the accusation and called Ms. Carroll a liar. And so she then sued him both for the underlying alleged sexual battery, but also for defamation because he'd gone on and called her a liar. And so you had the unusual thing of a civil trial about an alleged also criminal action that happened 20 years ago. And in fact, the law had to be specifically changed to allow this lawsuit to happen because it was so long ago. And New York State passed a law allowing adult victims of sexual crimes to sue past the statute of limitations. So that's kind of the basic and very serious sort of background to this case.
There's always some confusion around what assault is versus what battery is, because of course, in criminal trials, assault is physical assault, whereas it's verbal assault in civil cases. And I believe this is also the case for you. So we're talking about battery here being physical assault. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And as we make it into the question was then what was the subtype of the battery of the actual physical damage caused? So obviously one extreme is rape, but it could be forcible touching. These are all obviously serious, but they're sort of subspecies of battery, which is non-consensual touching that is the end point of an assault. And in this case, specifically sexual battery that is, say, motivated by a sexual motive and sexual in nature.
I think the other important thing as well here is that it's liable, not guilty. I know even Senator Mitt Romney's gone out and said that Trump was found guilty, but of course it's not guilty because it's a civil trial, not a criminal one. So does that mean that the onus of proof then is also lower? Because we all know that the go-to phrase for criminal onus of proof is it's beyond all reasonable doubt. Is that the same for civil trials, or is it something a bit different?
It is distinct. So it is by a preponderance of the evidence, when in the Commonwealth is something called the balance of probabilities. So if beyond reasonable doubt is the highest level, this is just 51% sure. It is that you think it's more likely than not based on the evidence something happened. And then that's slightly more confusing when it comes to the defamation, because in the US, defamation is more difficult. They have to show by clear and convincing evidence that the statement in question was false and with actual malice. But then again, it comes back to that 51% thing. And so it's very different from a criminal trial. Despite what some have been saying on the internet, Donald Trump is not convicted of a sexual offense. He's not a convicted sexual offender. He has merely been found liable by the jury to the civil standard and owes the civil remedy, which is damages.
Now, there are two issues here. First is sexual assault, battery, and then you've also got defamation. Might start with defamation. That's a bit easier here. Sexual assault is a bit more controversial because of its nature. So people often say from watching US legal dramas that, there's a higher standard in defamation for famous people in the US. Is that true? Is there a higher standard needed in those cases?
That is true. And it goes back to a case, New York Times versus Sullivan. And the idea behind it is that in order to show that you have defamed a public figure, you have to show that there was actual malice. Now, that, to be clear about that, that is the reverse of the standard. So it is in fact that the famous person has less protection in the US. That is to say, you have to show that you intentionally tried to disturb the reputation. The idea is because otherwise public figures could shut down debate by simply suing anyone who said something about them. Whereas for me, as much as Six News may bring me some fame, I'm not a public figure. And so if I sued, I would not need to prove that the person who defamed me had this thing of actual malice, which essentially it is essentially a way of saying that there was some intent to spread a falsehood or some failure to pay any attention to the truth. And in doing so, it brought it above. And this system has its critics, and it has its proponents, but one consequence is that if you are a public figure, and in this case, E Jean Carroll, who is suing, is a public figure because she's a writer, she's written her memoirs. So she has to show that when someone defames her, they met that higher actual malice standard.
So, of course, there are two political defamation cases in Queensland or in Australia right now. We've got Mark Latham and Pauline Hanson, both MPs for One Nation, and there are defamation cases against Greens MPs. So would we see the same sort of standards for those politicians if they were in the US?
Yes, yes. Even Pauline Hanson would have the same standards of protection as a public figure. The idea is that anyone who is sufficiently in the public and especially the political arena has to accept that there will be more speech about them, and that speech will be freer, and therefore it's harder for them to use the courts to get someone to stop talking about them, even if it happens to be untrue.
This is a question I've seen raised on Twitter a few times, or more so in relation to the Australian case, but it also would apply to Donald Trump here. If someone is seen unfavorably in the public eye, can they still be defamed? Is there a threshold you have to cross there for how popular you have to be before you can be defamed, or is it no matter how popular you are, you can still be defamed?
No, it's no matter how popular you are. Interestingly, there is some case law from England and the Commonwealth about, can you be so unpopular that you have no reputation to lose? And that has come up in some cases. But in general, the courts tend to regard that everyone with any kind of reputation, we all have reputations among our friends, our family, our community, can lose it and can be defamed. So even if you are the most popular person in the country, you can still be defamed.
I remember seeing, I believe it was last year, maybe the year before, there was the case between Palmer and Mark McGowan in Western Australia, and I believe that was like the fifth. There've been a heap of cases between those two over the last decade or so, a couple of decades, and I believe the judge in that one said that Clive Palmer, who's seen generally and say it's pretty uncontroversial to say he's unpopular, that when he defamed Mark McGowan, if anything, it would have made him more popular. So would that come up here as well, of course, because again, Donald Trump is such a controversial when it comes to whether or not he's popular. So would a case involving him help his reputation or harm him? Of course, he's the person who's defamed someone here. Of course, he's defamed the E Jean Carroll here. But if he was defamed, would that same sort of standard apply to him?
It might, but I think he could argue somewhat convincingly, and I think vice versa, as Carroll was able to argue, the idea that in a country where almost everyone has family member who voted the opposite way, almost everyone knows people, even if it's only Mr. Trump's followers who see his calling her a liar, and in fact, all of the people who already liked Miss Carroll think that that's a feather in her cap, that still impacts your reputation, because it's not a country segregated by politics as much as it's sometimes portrayed. So in the end, I think if it can really be shown that something was defamatory and actually malicious, there's a case that even someone who is in many circles as unpopular as Donald Trump is with half the country could still be defamed.
I like that segue, because one of the issues that I had actually about this was the jury, 9 people for this jury. Actually, firstly, before I get to the other point, why 9 people? Because usually we see it 12, occasionally 6. Why 9?
12 is standard for civil things. It's a New York thing. The US Supreme Court has pretty consistently ruled that there is no constitutional mandate to the number of jurors because the Constitution doesn't say. And so it's entirely possible to have a 9-person jury. 12 is standard in criminal cases always in America. But I think also, frankly, if you're administering the court system, even having 9-person juries makes it so much easier to fill out a case and do things because it's 3 fewer people you have to find, get in place, have substitutes for. So because this was always going to be by jury, I think it's one of the acceptable sort of compromises the civil system in the US makes.
I want to get back to that, but first, before I forget you, the question I had. Now, given that Trump's the former president, of course, he's got party ties to the Republican Party as a candidate who ran for them. Would that affect the jurors? Because, of course, whether would their party alignment come into play there, it's whether or not they'd be more inclined to find Trump liable or not. How do lawyers try and counteract any potential party bias there in the US?
Unquestionably, everyone in New York has heard of Donald Trump, and most people in this area do not like him. That said, there really is no choice, and I think there was, despite what Mr. Trump and his lawyers wanted, there was never going to be a chance of moving it, because that would essentially be saying that civil actions in the place where Donald Trump spends much of his time and has lived for many years are impossible. And so instead, the focus has been on reducing political pressure on the jury. So the Judge Kaplan, for example, made their identities secret. They will not be published. The lawyers in the case don't even know the identities, the full names of the jurors. They have been shielded from public view. And the idea is to allow them to just do their tasks without worrying about the political repercussions. Now, Mr. Trump has complained online, even in the hours after this verdict, that it's still unfair, that it's he was never going to get a fair trial there, and he can complain all he wants, but that's the thing about jury of your peers. And so because the jury just didn't particularly like him generally, as opposed to being prejudiced on the specific issues of the case, there was really no way they were ever going to move it out of New York.
Now, because he wants to appeal that case, which would then go. Well, actually, firstly, will that go Supreme Court, say Supreme Court, will that go Court of
No,
Appeal?
it will
What's
go
the
to
process here
circuit.
for it?
It will go to the Circuit Court of Appeals, which will hear the case. I think there will be 2 points. There'll be appealing it substantively, and I think there it's going to be difficult. I think in general, these sort of jury verdicts aren't usually overturned because that judges don't like to mess with juries unless there was some kind of procedural issue. And I'm fairly sure, given the nature of this case, that the judge will have been dotting every I and crossing every T and making sure everything was done as much as possible. There'll also be an appeal concurrently in the same appeal, the idea of damages. And that is where these appeals can be more successful because jurors kind of guess about dollar amounts. And when it is looked at on appeal, they'll be looked at. Then it would be the question, if Mr. Trump really wants to take it to the US Supreme Court, he can. That's not by right. He would have to petition the court, get a writ of certiorari. And I think the odds of this going to the Supreme Court are fairly unlikely because it's not an important legal case. It is an important political case, an important case in the news, but there's no real question of law that the Supreme Court would need to settle here.
Now, before we get to the case itself and go into some of the details that were discussed there, why is it that the US system has juries, basically every trial out there? Because, of course, in the Australian system, we don't have juries in civil trials. And although Section 80 of the Constitution says that there's a right to trial by jury in any indictable offence, the court's given a department to determine whether an offence is indictable or summary, and if it's a summary offence, there's no jury. So only sentences that Parliament wants to have a jury will have a jury for them if Parliament decides they're indictable. Is it the same thing in the US, or is it trial by jury for everyone, no matter what?
The U.S. Two-part answer. First, for all criminal offenses in the United States, except for petty offenses, which are usually defined, I think, by the Supreme Court precedent as punishable by under 6 months imprisonment. There is trial by jury, by constitutional right. In the federal system, civil cases, which are suits at common law with a value of over $20. The value is in the Constitution, so inflation has really changed it. So it is still $20. There is a right under the Seventh Amendment to a trial by jury. That right has not been incorporated against the states, and I'm not sure what the New York law is, but this case is being heard in federal court, I believe under diversity jurisdiction, because Donald Trump lives in Florida and E Jean Carroll lives in New York, and the Constitution allows for federal courts to have jurisdiction in suits from different states, and if the amount is as set by law, which is now I believe $75,000, and in federal court, federal procedural rules are applied, even as state common law is applied for substantive questions. And so the Seventh Amendment would apply, and I believe in New York this would be a jury trial anyway. And so therefore it would have to be by jury unless the parties agreed to waive it, which I don't see why they would.
And moving to the case itself, the big one everyone's talking about is why sexual assault and not rape? Because you'd think that there's a fine line between those two, but why did the jury distinguish between those two?
That is where the jury system in its majesty becomes this black box, and we don't know. I have seen some interesting speculation discussed online that, for example, this might be not a legal thing, but a cultural thing. The fact that the word rape is a very scary word. It's a very frightening word. And so sexual abuse sounded a more acceptable compromise to the jury than calling Trump a rapist, even though that's a legally ignorant result. It may also be that they thought, for example, in a department store, maybe it would be possible that he engaged in sexual abuse, but not rape. That is to say, in this context, penetrative sexual intercourse. The truth is, we won't know, and that's the jury system, and it's a black box, and so the verdict doesn't make much sense. Although for damages, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference in this case.
Let's go into damages for a bit, because the figure everyone's throwing around is, I believe it was it $5 million? Was that US or Australian? That
$5 million US is the figure I've seen.
Which make it 7 million Australian. So how was that the split? Because of course the defamation, and we've also got the sexual assault case there as well. Was it split 50-50, or how did the jury apportion that?
So it is split up, and on each case, the sums in question are enormous. And Australia often has discussions over if defamation damages are too high there, but these are some enormous numbers to go through them. So for the actual defamation, there was $1 million for general damages, $1.7 million for damages to reputation, and another $280,000 for punitive damages. And those are enormous sums. And that's what's often said about the U.S. system, is it's hard to prove defamation, but if you do, you can get quite a lot of money. And then separate to that, there was also $2 million that was awarded for the sexual abuse and the injury that it caused, which means that actually, and this may say something about the damage in the U.S. system, those who have done quick math will notice that there was more damage for the defamation than there was for the sexual assault, which seems anomalous, but may just be how defamation damages are done when you have juries awarding them.
Now, there are several types of damages we've got to play here. The main one is the punitive, where there are any other ones involved, because of course you do have things like aggravated and exemplary, which depends on, whether the circumstances, whether there was a lot of extra harm caused to the individual, whether the court wants to really punish Donald Trump for this, to set an example. Were there any other factors that came into play, or was it purely punitive, the compensation here?
Interestingly, of that 5 million, only 300,000 was punitive. Everything else was in some way compensatory. So for the sexual assault, $20,000 was given as punitive damages compared to the 2 million in compensation for the injuries. And that punitive damage was because the jury found that Mr. Trump had acted either wantonly or was reckless or with conscious disregard of the rights of Miss Carroll, which is an interesting way to frame it because one would assume that all sexual assaults involve some form of disregard of rights or recklessness. And then for the defamation, again, it was found that he had either acted maliciously out of hatred, ill will, spite, or disregard for the rights of another. And there, the punitive damages were much higher at 280,000. And so the rest is compensatory damages.
Well, of course, given Trump's net worth, $300,000 as punishment isn't really that much in the grand scheme of things for him, really, is it?
No, I suspect he spent more on lawyers than he will on those punitive damages. But the ultimate punitive damage is, of course, that he has now been found liable of sexual abuse by a court of law, and I think that will be the sort of the biggest lasting harm to sort of his reputation done by this case.
Okay, well, let's move on to that then. Does this, first, the big thing is, does this affect whether or not he can run in the next federal, the presidential election next year?
No, it does not. Losing a civil case certainly does not affect your ability to run for president. And even if this had been a criminal case, you are perfectly able to run for president from prison, provided you are not convicted of insurrection against the United States. So he will be able to run perfectly on this. It may even help his fundraising as he goes online and complains about the witch hunt and says that he needs help right now. So this may affect the general election, but I suspect even in the primary, the people who are still on the Trump train will just keep on riding.
And this is getting a bit more into the subjective opinion here, but do you think that the Trump train will win again next year in the primaries? Given, would this have actually any material effect? Because, of course, people like Mitt Romney are already complaining about the conviction. Oh, sorry, not conviction. That's my bad. They're him being found
But
liable.
Mitt Romney is complaining about the conviction, so you're right there.
Yeah, he did say guilty, and it's not guilty; it's liable. But Mitt Romney was of course opposed to him even back in 2016 when he ran then. So is this like, so of course we're going to see Republicans complain, but those who complain no matter what, will this actually sway anyone against Trump? Or
it's
will
hard
this
to
even
say.
work his advantage?
It might be to his advantage. So when Trump was indicted on criminal charges in New York State courts, his poll ratings went up, and DeSantis's poll ratings went down, his main rival. So to be honest, this may help him in the primary election, and it also may not matter even for the general election, if only because most people who dislike Trump already thought he was a sexual criminal. And once people had heard the infamous Access Hollywood grab them by the pussy tape, his sort of character wasn't really in doubt. So that is always the question of Donald Trump. Is there anything that could ever come out about him that would shock his supporters or these floating voters into voting differently? And so it's very hard to know. But one thing is pretty apparent from the polling: the more Trump is in the news, whether it's good or bad, the better he does against his rivals. His rivals do well when Trump is seen as retired and disappeared. So simply being in the headlines, even for the worst possible things, may be exactly what Trump needs at this point.
If Trump actually, he will appeal it if it goes on, because he probably won't reach the Supreme Court. But would the legal system try and get it all wrapped up before the next election, or could we see this drag out if Trump drags his feet, or if there are other delays? If COVID comes back, which is not likely, but it could happen, would the courts try and get this through quickly, or would they keep it at at a normal pace per se for a case.
So the Second Circuit, which would hear the appeals, I'm sure would try to move quickly, but the wheels of justice turn slow. It would probably be 6 months before hearings. It would take time. I suspect this will keep on trundling on and on. It is maybe a sign of the quality of the law in the United States that I think that this will be about as delayed and procedurally circuitous as any other appeal.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense to me. Would this, of course, we everyone who remembers the last election remembers that Trump went on to quite a significant extent about Joe Biden and alleging that Joe Biden has similar offenses against him that he has been convicted for. If Trump tries to make more accusations against whoever runs against him for who knows what, because let's face it, he's a populist. He's known for making those claims. Would this affect any credibility of any claims that he would make in his election process?
I think Donald Trump's credibility is pretty much the people who believe him will always believe him, and the people who don't believe him will never believe him. And I don't think anything will change that.
I wanted one more thing before we wrap up here, because we are moving close to the 30-minute mark. Would this set any precedent? Because I believe he's the first president to be convicted, to be found liable of sexual assault death penalty, and I believe he's the first one to actually have been found liable of anything in a civil court. Does this set a precedent for politicians? Should they be more careful with what they say and do now?
I think so. I think it should set a precedent that in the age of social media, taking to a social media platform to call someone a liar, to denounce them, can have legal consequences. And I think this will set a precedent about how the courts are dealing with new media, because for past presidents, they probably said a lot of intemperate things, but they had no way to disseminate them to the public. Whereas Trump, with no filter between his mind and what goes out online, was always going to be walking into legal jeopardy. And I think in future, there's going to be a lot more questions about how closely do social media teams run things past lawyers before they go out. And even if most candidates are more responsible than Trump, they will be taking notice of the fact that trying to live and engage online bears with it these kinds of legal risks. And I think that might be the biggest takeaway.
And of course, with social media going the way it is, with of course Trump now using Truth Social rather than Twitter, I don't believe we'd see any of the admins or the people behind Truth Social really try and censor Trump in the same way that Twitter or Facebook would if he made those sorts of claims. So of course he's pretty safe there, and he can't really get back onto Twitter like he could have been in the past, of course.
Yeah, and I think it will be interesting to see, because that for example, if Truth Social don't take Trump's post down, they could be sued if they refuse to take down such material. And so it will be interesting to see of how he tries to avoid things, but he already has been in trouble in his various ongoing cases for his comments on social media. And I think as much as he might like to pretend only his supporters read Truth Social, it's been very clear that, for example, Judge Kaplan was keeping an eye on what the Trumps were saying about the case as it went on. And I think the truth is, and this happens with ordinary defendants and litigants in cases all the time, judges can read what you post about them online.
Unfortunately, that's probably a lesson people won't learn fast enough. And I think that's an excellent spot to finish up on. Last episode, I said we'd touch on the Crown and coronation cases. Those are still coming. It's just that Trump's being found liable happened so quickly for us. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I'll have a larger back on next time to talk about either the coronation cases or the Crown. And we'll hopefully try and cover both of those. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.